What I'm about to share with you is not just a story. It's a memory buried beneath decades of silence, a secret that waited patiently to be found. It's the kind of tale that drifts between truth and emotion, held together by the thin thread of a single word tapped out in Morse code. This is the story of a love almost lost to history, and the final letter that carried it across time. But more than that, it's a story about the messages we send across the void of years, and the ones we receive when we're finally ready to listen. Margaret Whitmore had always believed she knew everything about the man she married. She could still remember the way Edward used to hum an old war tune while washing the dishes, something melancholy and French that she'd never been able to identify. She knew how he always brought her a daffodil every spring from the garden, a quiet tradition that started the year they wed, though he'd never explained why daffodils specifically. Their evenings were often spent in companionable silence, him with a crossword, her with her knitting, punctuated only by the occasional knowing glance across the room. After nearly 6 decades together, she'd come to think there was nothing left to discover. Marriage, she'd learned, was like slowly excavating a person layer by layer, until you reached bedrock, the final, unchanging self. She believed she'd reached Edward's bedrock years ago, and yet there was so much more waiting beneath the surface. For 58 years, she and Edward had shared a quiet life in a modest home on the edge of Kent. Their love was not of grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but of soft habits and silent understandings. The kind of love that had endured world wars, changing decades, and the slow fading of photographs on the mantel. They had weathered his nightmares in the early years, her miscarriages, his bout with pneumonia at 65, her mother's long decline into forgetfulness. They had built something steady and enduring, like a lighthouse weathering storms. But it was only after Edward's passing, at the age of 91, that Margaret discovered the secret he had kept hidden in the depths of his study. The room had remained untouched since the funeral 3 weeks prior, with his pipe still resting in the ashtray and the faint scent of old paper and tobacco lingering like the ghost of memory. Margaret had avoided entering, as if crossing the threshold might somehow make his absence more real. But the solicitor needed his papers, and she could delay no longer. She stepped inside with the solemn intention of sorting through his things, preparing herself for the familiar pain of touching objects that still held the warmth of his presence. She had not expected to find the envelope. It was buried beneath a false bottom in his desk drawer, a hiding place she'd never known existed in all their years together. The secret compartment was revealed only when she'd pulled the drawer out completely, frustrated by its tendency to stick. Something had rattled inside the desk frame, and when she'd reached in to investigate, her fingers had found the latch. The envelope was thick, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on it unmistakably his, the same careful script that had penned grocery lists and birthday cards for nearly 60 years. To Margaret, to be opened only when I am gone. She stared at it for a long time before opening it, as though some part of her already sensed the contents would unravel everything she thought she knew. Her hands trembled as she turned it over, noting the date pinned faintly in the corner, June 5th, 1982. The same date appeared year after year in his appointment diary, always marked with a simple R, for remembrance, she'd assumed. Remembrance of what? She'd never asked. Inside was a single sheet filled entirely with dots and dashes. Morse code. Margaret let out a breathless laugh, the sound brittle in the quiet room. Edward had always been fond of Morse. He'd tapped little messages into her hand when they were courting. I love you. Good night. Come home soon. A romantic quirk she'd found endearing. But this was different. This was a message meant to outlive him. She copied the code down on a fresh paper and began translating it slowly, using the small guidebook he had once gifted her for Christmas in 1954. Every good wife should know her husband's language, he'd said with a wink. As the letters began to emerge, so did the shape of a message that would change everything. Her fingers trembled as she wrote. Dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I have kept my silence. I kept the promise. But now I must tell you everything about Anna. Margaret stopped. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Anna? The name hung in the air, like a question mark. She had never heard it before. And in 58 years, Edward had never mentioned another woman. She read on, her world quietly rearranging itself with each decoded letter. It was the spring of 1944, and I was stationed in Normandy with the Royal Signals Corps. Our job was to intercept and relay communications between the front lines and command. The work was tedious most days, hours of static punctuated by moments of crucial intelligence. That's where I met her, Anna Moreau, a resistance courier. Fluent in code, fierce in spirit, and carrying secrets that could change the course of the war. The words painted a world Margaret had never imagined. Edward, young and lean, his uniform dusty with war. Anna, with her dark hair tucked under a scarf, slipping past enemy lines with messages sewn into her coat. Margaret tried to picture her husband at 22, tried to imagine the man she'd married existing in a world of bullets and betrayal. At first, it was only transmissions, then glances, then quiet words between assignments. She had a laugh that could cut through the sound of artillery, and hands that moved like music when she worked the radio. She taught me phrases in French, not the textbook kind, but the kind that lovers whisper in the dark. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Not quite jealousy. How could she be jealous of a ghost? But something deeper, a sense of displacement, as if she'd discovered that the foundation of her house had been built on someone else's dreams. And one night, after a near-miss ambush that left us both shaking, she took my hand and tapped 3 dots. S. Our little signal. Goodbye for now. But also, stay safe. I think we fell in love somewhere between fear and survival, in that peculiar way that only war can forge. The letter continued, describing stolen moments between missions. Anna teaching Edward to identify German aircraft by their engine sounds. Edward showing her how to repair a damaged radio with nothing but wire and hope. They had carved out a pocket of tenderness in the midst of chaos. She had a photograph of a little girl, blonde, serious, with eyes that seemed to hold too much understanding for her age. My daughter, she'd said simply. Elise. She's safe with my mother in the South. I never asked about the father. In wartime, you learn not to ask questions that might have painful answers. Margaret paused in her translation. A daughter. The plot thickened, and she found herself leaning forward, as if physical proximity to the page might reveal its secrets faster. On the night before the landings, June 5th, Anna was sent through the valley to deliver intel to a unit trapped behind the German line. The intelligence was crucial, German troop movements that could save hundreds of Allied lives. I begged her not to go. The route was compromised. We both knew it. But she only smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, "You'll hear from me." Then she tapped our signal into my palm. SS. But her message never came. Margaret felt her breath catch. The story was drawing her in like a tide, and she couldn't resist its pull. For weeks, I monitored every frequency, hoping for word. I questioned every resistance contact, searched every casualty report. There were no records, no body, only silence. The kind of silence that echoes louder than any scream. The letter described Edward's return to England, how he'd carried Anna's memory like shrapnel in his chest, painful, but somehow necessary. He'd been unable to speak of the war for years, unable to explain to Margaret why he sometimes woke up calling out in French, why he couldn't bear to listen to certain songs on the radio. I met you in 1952, and you were like sunlight after a long winter. You never asked about the shadows in my past, and I loved you for that kindness. We married that autumn, and I never looked back. I thought I had buried Anna with the war. I thought love was singular, that the heart could hold only one truth at a time. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of those early years of their marriage, how Edward had sometimes seemed to be listening for something she couldn't hear, how he'd insisted on keeping the old radio in the kitchen, tuned to frequencies that carried nothing but static. I was wrong. Love isn't singular. It's geological. It builds in layers. The phrase struck Margaret like a physical blow. She'd never thought of love that way, but suddenly it made perfect sense. She could love Edward completely while understanding that he'd loved someone else first, and maybe still. Until 1981. That year, I was assisting with the calibration of shortwave units in a decommissioned bunker outside Dover. Routine work, really, updating equipment that had been gathering dust since the war. One evening, as I was aligning the receiver, I caught a weak signal. 3 letters. Morse. I knew the rhythm instantly. It was her. Margaret's hands were shaking now as she continued the translation. The story was taking a turn she hadn't expected. Just one word, forgive. Margaret let the paper fall in her lap. The room felt too quiet. She reached for Edward's old Morse key on the desk and rested her fingers on it. The brass was cold beneath her touch, worn smooth by decades of use. Had he come here, night after night, hoping for another message? Was this the place he grieved silently for a woman Margaret had never known existed? She forced herself to continue reading. I sent a message back immediately. Anna, it's Edward. Where are you? But the signal was gone. I spent the next 3 nights at that bunker, transmitting every frequency I could think of, but heard nothing in return. I began to think I'd imagined it. That grief had finally driven me to hear voices in the static. The letter went on to describe Edward's careful, methodical search for Anna. He'd used his connections in the telecommunications industry to trace the signal's origin, had written letters to French veterans organizations, had even hired a private investigator in Lyon. The search had taken months, conducted in absolute secrecy. Eventually, I found a burial record. Annette Vasseur died in 1982. A widow. 1 daughter. No husband listed. The pieces clicked together like cold iron. Margaret's mind raced. Anna had died the year after sending the signal. Had she been ill? Had she somehow known her time was running out? I found her address. A small apartment in Marseille. The investigator confirmed that she had lived there alone for decades, worked as a telegraph operator for the post office. She never remarried. Her daughter, Elise, had grown up and moved to Paris. But here's what haunts me. Margaret. The investigator said that Anna had kept a radio in her apartment, tuned to the same frequency where I'd heard her voice. She had been listening. For 37 years, she had been listening. The weight of that revelation settled over Margaret like a shroud. Anna had never stopped waiting. For nearly 4 decades, she had sat by her radio, hoping to hear the voice of a man she'd loved and lost in the chaos of war. She had a daughter, Margaret. I don't know if she was mine. The timeline, it's possible. Elise was born in 1939, and Anna and we were together in early 1944. But I never found out. I never asked. I didn't want to undo what we had built. But I kept the letter, in case you ever needed to know, in case she ever reached out. The letter ended with a simple line, I loved you. In peace, I chose you. For days, Margaret said nothing. She told no one. She reread the letter every morning, as if waiting for it to change. But instead, something in her shifted. The anger she'd expected never came. Instead, she felt something she hadn't anticipated. Curiosity. Who was this woman who had captured Edward's heart so completely that he'd carried her memory for nearly 60 years? What she looked like? What had her voice sounded like? And most importantly, what had become of her daughter? At 84, Margaret Whitmore made a decision that surprised even herself. She booked a flight to Lyon, France. Alone. Her daughter Susan was horrified. Mother, you can't just fly off to France by yourself. You don't speak French. You don't know anyone there. What if something happens? But Margaret had made up her mind. She'd lived her entire life as half of a couple, defining herself in relation to Edward. Now, for the first time, she was going to discover something on her own. As the engines hummed and clouds drifted past the window, her mind swam with a sea of questions. What would she find? Who would she meet? Her hands gripped the armrests tightly during takeoff, not out of fear, but out of the weight of what lay ahead. She thought of Edward in his younger days, his steady hands, his calm voice, the quiet laughter they shared over morning tea. She remembered how he used to look out at the horizon during long drives, as though part of him was always somewhere far away. Was that part of him with Anna? Had he been divided all along? Margaret closed her eyes and pressed her fingers together, as if to feel again the faint, familiar taps he used to send into her palm. I love you. 3 simple words in a rhythm she now questioned. The hum of the plane matched the beat of her heart, steady, anxious, full of things unsaid. She was going not just in search of answers, but to meet the woman who might carry the last echo of Edward's unspoken past. The Center de Documentation de la Resistance in Lyon was housed in a converted monastery, its stone walls thick with the weight of history. Margaret had practiced her request in French during the flight, but when she actually stood before the archivist, the words came out in a jumbled mix of English and what she hoped was French. Fortunately, the archivist, a young woman named Emily with kind eyes and patient smile, spoke excellent English. You are researching the war, madam? A family member? Margaret hesitated. How to explain that she was searching for traces of her husband's secret love? My husband served with the resistance. I'm trying to understand, to fill in some gaps in his story. Emily nodded knowingly. Many families are still piecing together these stories. The war scattered so many lives, so many records. What unit was he with? Royal Signals Corps. He worked with a woman named Anna Moreau, or possibly Annette Vasseur. She was a courier. Emily's expression shifted slightly. Vasseur. That name is familiar. Let me check our records. She disappeared into the archives, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the weight of stone walls that had witnessed decades of secrets. When Emily returned, she carried a box of photographs and documents. We have some records of the Normandy cell. Would you like to see them? Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The photographs were haunting, young faces staring out from black and white prints, most of them knowing they might not survive the war. And there, in the third photograph, was Edward. Young, serious, standing beside a woman with striking eyes and a red scarf. Anna. Margaret's breath caught. The woman was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was an intensity in her gaze, a determination that seemed to leap from the photograph across the decades. Margaret could see why Edward had fallen in love with her. But beside Anna was Child, a girl of about 5, with blonde hair and serious eyes. The same eyes from the photograph Edward had described in his letter. This is the daughter, Emily said gently. Elise. She would be, let me see, about 80 now. Margaret's heart began to race. Is she? Do you know if she's still alive? I could check our records. Many of the children from the war years stayed in touch with our organization. Give me a moment. Margaret waited, studying the photograph. Edward looked so young, so earnest. And Anna looked like a woman who could change the world or die trying. Madame Whitmore, Emily said, returning with a file. Elise Vasseur is alive. She lives in an assisted living facility near Marseille. I have her address, if you'd like it. Margaret's hands trembled as she accepted the piece of paper. Thank you. This means more than you know. Madame, Emily said gently, may I ask why this is important to you? Forgive me if I'm being too personal, but this seems very emotional for you. Margaret looked down at the photograph again, at the woman who had loved her husband before she'd even met him. I'm trying to understand a part of my husband's life that he never shared with me. I think he loved her very much. Emily nodded. The war created many such stories. Love interrupted, lives divided. Perhaps finding this woman's daughter will help you understand not just your husband's past, but your own story as well. The train from Lyon to Marseille took Margaret through countryside that seemed to pulse with history. She pressed her face to the window, watching vineyards and olive groves roll past, wondering if Anna had traveled these same routes during the war, carrying messages that could save lives or cost them. The Residence Soleil was a pleasant facility overlooking the Mediterranean, its white buildings gleaming in the afternoon sun. Margaret had called ahead, explained who she was and why she wanted to meet Elise. The conversation had been stilted, conducted in a mixture of English and French, but Elise had agreed to see her. She's waiting for you in the garden, the receptionist told Margaret. She seemed quite moved by your call. Margaret found her way to the garden, where an elderly woman sat alone at a small table beneath an olive tree. She was elegant despite her age, with silver hair pulled back in a chignon and eyes that were unmistakably familiar. They were Edward's eyes, Madam Whitmore, Elise said, rising carefully. Her English was accented but clear. I've been waiting for this moment my entire life. Margaret felt her composure crumble. You have Edward's eyes, she whispered. Elise smiled, expression both sad and knowing. I've been told this before. Please sit. We have much to discuss. Margaret pulled the letter from her purse with shaking hands. He wanted you to know, she said. He wanted you to know that he never forgot. Elise read the letter in silence, her lips moving slightly as she translated the English in her mind. When she reached the word forgive, tears began to stream down her cheeks. She never told me, Elise said finally. My mother, she never spoke his name. But every year, on June 5th, she would sit by the radio. She would tune it to different frequencies, listening, always listening. I thought she was remembering the war, the friend she had lost. I never knew she was listening for one voice in particular. Tell me about her, Margaret said gently. Elise's eyes grew distant. She was magnificent, fierce and gentle at the same time. She taught me to be brave, to stand up for what was right. But she was also very sad, I think. There was always a part of her that seemed to be waiting for something or someone to come home. Did she ever speak of the war? Only once. I was perhaps 20, and I asked her about my father. She said he was a good man, a brave man who had died in the war. She said he had loved us both, but that love sometimes meant letting go. I never understood what she meant until now. Margaret felt her heart breaking for all of them, for Anna, waiting by the radio, for Edward, carrying his secret, for Elise, growing up without knowing her father's name. There's something else, Elise said, reaching in her handbag. My mother, she wrote something before she died. I never understood it until now. She handed Margaret a small envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a torn scrap of paper, the writing faded but legible. To Edward. I never stopped listening. Tell her thank you. Margaret stared at the note, overwhelmed by its implications. Anna had known about her, had known that Edward had found love again, had built a life with someone else, and she had been grateful for it. She wanted him to be happy, Elise said quietly. She told me once that the greatest gift of love is knowing when to let go. I think she let go of him so he could love you completely. They sat together for a long time, two women bound by love, loss, and a man who had lived a life within a life. Margaret found herself telling Elise stories about Edward, how he hummed French songs, how he brought her daffodils every spring, how he sometimes woke up speaking words in a language she didn't understand. The daffodils, Elise said suddenly. They were my mother's favorite flower. She grew them in window boxes, said they were a promise that winter would always end. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. All these years, Edward had been bringing her Anna's favorite flowers. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a bridge between his two loves, a way of honoring both. Would you like to see her grave? Elise asked. I visit every week. The cemetery overlooked the sea, its white stones gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Anna's grave was simple, marked only with her name and dates. But Elise had planted daffodils around it that were just beginning to bloom. Margaret knelt beside the grave, feeling foolish but somehow compelled to speak aloud. I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted to thank you for letting him go, for letting him love me. She felt Elise's hand on her shoulder. I think she can hear you. I think she's been waiting for you to come. Margaret pulled the Morse key from her purse. She'd taken it from Edward's desk before leaving England. Carefully, she placed it on the gravestone. He carried your memory for 60 years, she said, but he chose to build a life with me. I think you would have liked that. As they stood in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of understanding. Love wasn't diminished by being shared. It was multiplied. There's something I need to tell you, Elise said as they walked back to the car. About the signal my mother sent in 1981. She didn't send it randomly. She was dying, and she knew it. Cancer. She had perhaps weeks to live. Margaret stopped walking. She was saying goodbye. Yes, but also, she was asking permission. Permission to let go. Permission to stop waiting. When Edward didn't respond immediately, she took it as his answer. She could finally rest. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. But he did respond. He tried to reach her for months. I know, but perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps some goodbyes are meant to be final. Margaret returned to England with Anna's letter in her pocket and a strange peace in her heart. The house felt different somehow, not haunted by secrets, but enriched by them. She found herself seeing Edward's belongings with new eyes, understanding now the layers of memory they held. In his study, she discovered other artifacts of his hidden life. A French-English dictionary, worn soft with use. A photograph of Norman countryside that she'd always assumed was a postcard. A small notebook filled with what she now recognized as coded messages. That night, she sat at Edward's desk, turned the old Morse key gently, and tapped 3 soft dots. S. The same way Anna had said goodbye. The same way Edward had remembered. She smiled through her tears. Over the following months, Margaret found herself corresponding with Elise, exchanging stories and photographs, slowly piecing together the full picture of Edward's war years. Elise sent her Anna's wartime diary, which had been hidden in the same box as her final letter. Margaret had it translated, and found herself reading the day-by-day account of a love affair that had shaped the rest of Edward's life. June 3rd, 1944. Edward taught me to say I love you in Morse code today. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. But I prefer our signal, just S. Simpler. More us. June 4th, 1944. Tomorrow's mission feels different. Heavier. Edward begged me not to go, but I must. Henry's unit is trapped, and they need the German positions. I kissed him goodbye and promised to come back. Some promises are easier to make than to keep. June 5th, 1944. If I don't return, I want Edward to know that loving him was the bravest thing I ever did. War makes cowards of us all, except when it comes to love. Love makes us heroes. The final entry was dated June 5th, 1944. Anna had never returned from her mission, but the diary revealed that she had been captured, not killed. She had spent the final months of the war in a prison camp, surviving on the hope of seeing Edward again. When she was liberated, she returned to find that he had been shipped back to England, and none of their mutual contacts knew how to reach him. I will wait, she had written on a scrap of paper found with the diary. However long it takes, I will wait. And she had waited. For 37 years. Margaret found herself oddly comforted by this revelation. Edward hadn't abandoned Anna. He had simply been lost to her, as she had been lost to him. They had both been victims of war's cruel geography. 6 months after her return from France, Margaret received a letter that changed everything once again. It was from Elise, but this time she wasn't writing alone. Dear Margaret, the letter began, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to share wonderful news. My mother's belongings were stored in my aunt's attic for decades, and we have only recently gone through them completely. We found something that I believe belongs to you. Enclosed was a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a Morse key, identical to the one Edward had used, but this one was engraved with initials, AMTW 1944. Anna had made it for Edward, had intended to give it to him when she returned from her final mission. Instead, she had carried it with her for the rest of her life, a talisman of love interrupted. But there was more. Also in the package was a letter, written in Edward's handwriting but in Anna's possession. A letter he had somehow managed to send to her after the war, one that had found its way to her but had never been answered. My dearest Anna, it read, I don't know if this letter will find you, or if you are even alive to read it. I have searched for you everywhere, but the war has scattered us all like leaves in a storm. I am returning to England, and I don't know if I will ever see France again. But I need you to know that loving you is not something I did in spite of the war. It was something I did because of it. In the midst of death and destruction, you showed me what it meant to be alive. I will carry you with me always, in the rhythm of 3 dots tapped against my heart. If you are reading this, know that you are not forgotten. If you are not, then I hope these words somehow find their way to you across whatever divide separates us now. The letter was dated December 1944, just 3 months before Edward met Margaret. Elise had included a note. She kept this letter with her until the day she died. I think she wanted you to have it, to understand that their love was real, but so was his love for you. She never answered it because she knew he needed to move forward, to build a life without her. It was her final gift to him. Margaret held the letter for a long time, feeling the weight of the words Edward had written before he'd ever known her name. Then she carefully placed it in the box with his other belongings, alongside the Morse key, and on June 5th, the anniversary of Anna's final mission, Margaret began a new tradition. She would sit in Edward's study, turn on the old radio, and listen to the static across various frequencies. Not because she expected to hear anything, but because listening had become a form of prayer, a way of honoring the love that had made her own possible. Sometimes she would tap out messages on the Morse key, "Thank you, Anna," or simply, "S." One evening, as she sat listening to the familiar hiss of static, she heard something that made her heart skip. Not a voice, not a message, but a rhythm in the white noise, 3 dots, repeated 3 times. SSS. She sat perfectly still, listening. The pattern repeated, faint but unmistakable. Margaret smiled and reached for the Morse key. Carefully, deliberately, she tapped out a response. Received. Over and out. The static continued, but the pattern was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there at all. It didn't matter. Some conversations transcend the boundaries of time and space, continuing in the spaces between heartbeats, in the rhythm of memory, in the eternal echo of love that refuses to be silenced. Margaret turned off the radio and sat in the quiet study, surrounded by the artifacts of 2 love stories that had somehow become one. She thought of Edward, young and brave in wartime France. She thought of Anna, waiting by her radio for 37 years. She thought of herself, discovering at 84 that her own love story had been larger and more complex than she'd ever imagined. Some stories didn't end, she realized. They just waited to be heard. And some love letters, even written in code, still spoke louder than words. In the months that followed, Margaret began writing her own story. Not just the account of her journey to France, but the fuller story of her marriage, seen now through the lens of Edward's secret past. She wrote about the French songs he'd hummed, the daffodils he'd brought her, the way he'd sometimes held her hand and tapped out messages in a language she hadn't fully understood. She wrote about the night terrors that had plagued him in their early years together, how he'd wake up speaking French words that sounded like prayers or apologies. She wrote about his insistence on keeping the old radio, his yearly disappearances on June 5th that he'd explained as memorial services for fallen comrades. All of it made sense now. Edward hadn't been living a double life. He'd been living a layered one, where past and present coexisted like overlapping radio frequencies, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, but always broadcasting. Margaret's story found its way to Elise, who translated it into French and shared it with other families of resistance fighters. It became part of the historical record, a testament to the complexity of love in wartime and the courage required to carry someone else's secrets. But perhaps more importantly, it became a bridge between 2 women who had loved the same man in different times, different ways, for different reasons. Through their correspondence, Margaret and Elise became friends, then family of choice, bound together by the invisible threads of shared history and mutual understanding. On Margaret's 85th birthday, Elise came to visit England. She brought with her a small suitcase filled with Anna's belongings, photographs, letters, the diary Margaret had read in translation, and a small wooden box containing soil from the garden where Anna had grown her daffodils. "My mother would have wanted you to have these," Elise said. She believed that love stories should be complete, even if they're complicated. Margaret accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. That evening, she and Elise sat in Edward's study, sharing tea and stories. 2 elderly women united by a man who had learned that the heart's capacity for love was not limited by time or distance or even death itself. As the sun set over the Kent countryside, casting long shadows through the window, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of endings, but of understanding. She had lived a beautiful life with Edward, full of quiet joys and steady love. But she had also been part of a larger story, a story that included a brave woman in wartime France, a daughter who had grown up without knowing her father's name, and a love that had transcended the boundaries of war and time. The Morse key sat on Edward's desk, silent now, but somehow still humming with the echoes of all the messages it had carried. Messages of love, of loss, of forgiveness, of hope. Messages that had traveled across decades and continents to find their intended recipients. Margaret reached out and touched the key gently, feeling the smooth brass beneath her fingers. Then, almost without thinking, she tapped out a final message, not to Anna, not to Edward, but to herself. Message received. Love multiplied. Story complete. The sound echoed in the quiet room, then faded into silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, full of the promise that some stories, once told, continue to resonate forever. And in the space between the dots and dashes, between the words spoken and unspoken, between the love that was and the love that is, Margaret Whitmore finally understood the full scope of her own extraordinary, ordinary life. The last love letter written in Morse code had been decoded at last, but its message would continue transmitting, frequency by frequency, heart by heart, for as long as anyone was willing to listen.